Hello everyone, welcome back to the class. So this week we are going to watch this documentary, The Search for General Tso or General Tso or whatever you want to pronounce it, because it's kind of a indefinite pronunciation for the word TSO. And I think I have been mentioning this documentary 1,000 times in this course so far, and eventually now we are getting into this documentary, and I hope you really enjoyed it. So the title is The Search for General Tso, and the question for these 2 weeks is all about the definition of Chinese food. So basically, we want to ask, what is Chinese food? Because if we're thinking about it, thinking about this question geographically, we'll say, is Chinese food the food in China, within the territory of China, or ethnically, whether the Chinese food should be the food made by Chinese? And I think this documentary proposed a third option, that is, what about food made by Chinese out of China? Is that considered Chinese food as well? What kind of variation it possesses, and what kind of idea we should put onto this idea of Chinese food made by Chinese but out of China. And first, I want to make a comparison between A Bite of China versus The Search of General Tso. So, A Bite of China is what we watched last week. And for A Bite of China, I will say it is mainly about how Chinese, or more specifically, how Chinese government understand and want to promote Chinese food. As we said last time in the class discussion and in my second lecture video, it is almost all about propaganda, national propaganda. You can understand this whole TV series in that direction. But for the search for General Tso, it is more about how Americans or Chinese immigrants understand, define, and decipher Chinese food. So it is not government endorsed and not that related to the huge national propaganda, but more to a individual perspective or the minor perspective by the Chinese immigrants. And I think it may not be that prominent, but if we place these two, this TV series versus this documentary side by side, we can still see a battle for the power of discourse. That is to say, well, who has the power to define what is Chinese food? Is it Chinese or the Chinese government, or the people living overseas, the Chinese immigrants or other people? So this idea of how to define what is Chinese food is very interesting if we put these two videos side by side. And also we can see a lot of differences and similarities if we compare them. And as I said in the forum, I think one of the very interesting differences is that A Bite of China uses a lot of voiceover and has a coherent narrative to tell you what is Chinese food, what is the cultural meaning behind it, things like that. But for The Search for General Tso, there's no voiceover or whatsoever, but characters in that documentary speaks for themselves or speaks for the idea they hold. So these two kind of choices is very interesting to think about. I think there's something a little bit more than the aesthetic choices, and also something related to the overall meaning or intent of these two different kind of TV series or film. So I think that this is one way we can compare these two work. And I am sure there's a lot of other differences or similarities, and I am all for it. So you can write down everything if you find anything interesting on the forum or bring it to the classroom discussion. So some facts about The Search for General Tso. So first, it is a documentary premiered at the 2014 Tribeca Film Festival, and it is directed by Ian Cheney and produced by Amanda Murray and Jennifer Lee. So this is a picture of the director Ian Cheney And this is the picture of the producer Jennifer Lee. A little bit more about the director Ian Chaney. So he is also the director for the another documentary film called King Kong. And from the title, you can already see he has some sort of a special interest in documenting the idea about food. So the Search of General Tso is about one Chinese dish, while the documentary King Kong is about how the industrialized corn industry in the America kind of destroys the family-owned farm. And I think this is a very that's a very interesting documentary film as well. And a little bit more about the producer Jennifer Lee, and she is also the author for the article excerpt I assigned for Wednesday, that is a Fortune Cookie Chronicle. So you can see she originates from mainland China and immigrants to Taiwan and then to America. So we can consider she as a Chinese immigrant. So she sort of wrote about her own idea, experience, and thinking about Americanized Chinese food or Chinese food in America into this book, The Fortune Cookie Chronicles. And that's and the General Tso's the chicken General Tso's chicken also owns one chapter in this book. So I think this is a very interesting book to take a look at. And the book is the one of the promo word for this book is it kind of describes how Chinese food is more all American than apple pie. Very interesting concept. And also this book is kind of a bestseller. It listed at number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. So I assigned the first chapter, or we can consider it as a preface to the whole book on Wednesday. You can take a look at that and pair it with the whole film to get an overall idea of how the producer, especially Jennifer Lee, thinking about the Americanized Chinese food. Another thing I want to draw your attention to is the origin story of this whole film. So according to Jia Yanfang, the writer for the New Yorker, dated back to the 2015, the whole original story of this documentary film is that 10 years ago, the director Ian Chaney was driving across the United States on his way to make another film about corn, which is actually the King Kong, as I said earlier. When he stopped for the night, seemingly in the middle of nowhere, and ordered his old standby at the only restaurant open, a Chinese one. Something about this time and place and town made me wonder, who is this General Tso? Chaney said in an interview with the website Fred TV. To explore that question, he teamed up with Jennifer Lee, who wrote about the dish in her 2008 book, The Fortune Cookie Chronicles. The pair embarked on a bicontinental investigation, flitting between the East and West in pursuit of the recipe's provenance. So this kind of tells us a little story of how to begin or why to begin such a documentary film. And I will put the link to this very interesting interview with the website Fred TV in the description box, so you can check it by yourself. But I think one thing very interesting and kind of became a signature picture of a Chinese restaurant is at night, just like the background picture. So at night, in the middle of nowhere, and there's always a Chinese restaurant open which serves General Tso's chicken. I think this idea is very interesting and kind of shapes our understanding, or actually the director's understanding, and the whole representation in this film about Chinese restaurant, which is so strong to be able to survive in the middle of nowhere and is always serving the food which can comfort you. So that idea of Chinese restaurant is very interesting, and we can already see it in the origin story of this film. So a little bit summary about the film. This is from actually the film's official website. I just quoted the very last sentence of that whole summary. It said that, told with the verve of a good detective story, the search for General Tso is as much about food as it is a tale for the American immigrant experience. So after watching the film, you'll realize actually, from the title, we'll know like this film is all about the food and all about one particular dish, the General Tso's chicken, but it kind of expanded its scope by telling the story from the perspective of American immigrant experience. So I'll say it kind of begins with a kind of trivial, or you can say it ridiculous question: who is General Tso? And to answer this question, it kind of go over the history of Chinese food in America and the experience of Chinese immigrants, or the history of Chinese immigrants in America. And eventually, this film answers the question with a profound answer. So I don't want to spoil it if you haven't watched the whole film, but I think this process is very interesting, and I would consider it as one of the best ways to start any research project when you're thinking about writing a paper or doing a final project or things like that. So I would say first begin with a very even trivial, ridiculous, hilarious, but interesting question. Begin with a very, very small question, and in the process of answering this question, you will inevitably go over some perspective of history or culture or things like that. And in that by doing that, you will expand the scope of your project and make it profound and deeper. So everything will start with one trivial question, and I think this is one of the good example to demonstrate to you how it can be done, and how it can be done, I would say, successfully. And some issue to pay attention to when watching this film is that first, transculture interpretation or assimilation. That is to say, how when Chinese food get to the America, how it is interpreted by the Chinese immigrants and Americans, and how it gets localized and somehow different or totally different from its Chinese origin. And also the idea of the discrimination and acceptance, how these two concepts work in the whole communication between different cultures. And again, I don't want to spoil it, but after watching the whole film, you will realize there's a very interesting story told by a Jewish family, and how Jewish connected to Chinese food, and how that represents the idea of the ethnic food, or different, a sort of I would say a model of transcultural communication in America. And also this concept is very important, and I think we were talking about it once again in this semester. That is the idea and the significance or insignificance of authenticity. So I think last time when we had the classroom discussion, we touched upon this question about authenticity and why it is important. And I'll say this film sort of deconstruct that idea of authenticity. And in the end, it tells us, or it kind of raises the question, how or why authenticity is important, or is it important? I think this question we can understand this question from different perspectives, but one of them is whether the appreciation for authenticity also kind of represent the generation gap, which means the older generation appreciate authenticity more, while the younger generation is more open and can accept anything. Whether kind of there's a generation gap in the idea of authenticity. And also, this is also another interesting story, so I want you to watch it by yourself. But this story actually very unexpectedly tells us a story about the failure of the authentic. So you will find it by yourself, but from that particular perspective, we can think of like why the authentic will fail, but the adapted ones, the localized one, will succeed. And also, the bigger picture, if we put this one dish or this one film in a big picture, we'll see how politics influence culture or influence the representation of culture. And I think this question is very big and can connect it to different works we have been watching for this whole semester, thinking about A Bite of China, how it became a national propaganda, and how politics influence the whole representation of Chinese food there. And also in this film, it kind of raised multiple examples to tell you the communication or the relationship between America and China kind of greatly influenced the Chinese food in America. And one more thing is the meaning lying behind the food. That is to say, what is the meaning, or is there a meaning lying behind the food? Because when we watch A Bite of China, we always thinking about tofu represent the simple life, or the making of tofu represent Chinese people's ability to convert anything to the things useful to them. That kind of meaning is lying. If that kind of meaning is lying behind the dish of tofu, then I will ask like whether there's a meaning lying behind General Tso's chicken as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is the two sides of Chinese culture. And if we were to define that, because I don't think there's only two sides, but these two kind of contrast to each other and complement each other. So the first side is a refined one, just as what represented by A Bite of China. So Chinese culture has a long history, and it kind of have some representation in its food, and showed us a close connection between food and people or things like that. That kind of, I will define it as a refined Chinese culture. While in this documentary film, I will say Chinese culture is represented in a more practical way or a more down-to-earth way. And it kind of, I will say it kind of make us think more about is there only one interpretation about Chinese culture, or how can we decipher the multiple layers of different perspective of Chinese culture, and is that important, and why? Okay, so I think this is about the introduction to this film, and I really hope you enjoyed it. So please leave your comments in this video to address the question I proposed in this lecture, or anything related to your watching experience, or just about anything about General Tso's chicken. Actually, one fun fact is that after watching this film, it makes me so hungry, so I get to the Chinese restaurant near me to buy one General Tso's chicken. I don't think I ever tried it before, in particular, like intentionally tried it. I may have it in some Chinese buffet, but I never intentionally go to a Chinese restaurant to buy it. But after watching this film, it kind of make me mouth-watering and actually very curious about what exactly is the General Tso's chicken in my region. So I went out to buy it, and I can tell you it tastes very good. Actually, unexpectedly good. So maybe we can also share your own experience with this one dish, General Tso's chicken, in the forum, in this comments, or in Friday's classroom discussion. Okay, I think that would be very fun. Okay, so I think that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your comments, and see you on Wednesday. Bye.